I was reading James Clear's excellent book, Atomic Habits, some time ago now, and there was a quote in there, just something he mentions in there that made me stop in my tracks, as so often happens when I'm reading a book like this, which just said, if you can't win by being better, win by being different. Now, I closed the book. Well, you don't really do that with a Kindle, do you? But I put my book down to one side and I started to think about these things, as I always do to begin with. When a quote strikes me like that, the first thing that I tend to do is have a think about people that I know of that do exactly what this quote says. It gives me some sort of context. So to think about being innovative in the way that you go about doing something in terms of being different, I kind of thought about it in terms of sport as being kind of two main areas really. One, the people that have kind of approached a sport in a different way, so actually doing the sport in a different context. And then there are people that exist in a kind of more accepted context that have approached the way they carry that out in their own individual way. So let's begin by having a look at people that have approached the sport in its entirety in a different way. And we're going to begin with a surfer called Laird Hamilton. So Laird Hamilton left the successful, accepted kind of world championship circuit to develop something called tow-in surfing. Now, tow-in surfing means you're pulled in by a jet ski or something similar that will enable you to ride the biggest and the heaviest waves that have ever existed on the planet. And then you've got Kilian Jornet. So of course, Jornet is a runner, but he's not just any runner. Previously, he's held the records for ascending and descending, running up Aconcagua and Denali, and apologies if my pronunciation is well off mark here, and Kilimanjaro, and he currently holds the records for running up and down the Matterhorn and Mont Blanc. And then we've got Dame Ellen MacArthur, and Ellen MacArthur held the world record for the fastest solo circumnavigation of the planet in a sailing boat. And then bringing it a bit closer to home, of course, we've got Mark Beaumont, who is a racing cyclist, but not just any racing cyclist. He doesn't race in the World Tour. And if you followed this channel for a while, you know I'm a massive fan of Mark Beaumont. He rode around the world in the fastest ever time, breaking the world record by a massive distance, covering the entire distance in 78 days. So all of these people are in a certain sport, but they've looked globally at the sport in a different way. But what if we wanted to think about the sports that we're in a more generic context, i.e. we wanted to race triathlon in Olympic or sprint distance, or Ironman or half Ironman, or take part in time trials and the like. So what ways could we be different in there? And again, it got me thinking about the innovators within the context of the sport generically. So let's look at somebody like Billy Beane. Now, Billy Beane is an economics graduate, and he was in charge of the Oakland Athletics baseball team. Now, the Oakland Athletics baseball team don't have a huge amount of money. In fact, in terms of the lowest paid teams, they are 24th out of 30. But they managed to become the first team in 100 years plus of American League Baseball to win 20 consecutive games. And the way he did this was to use his economics background to look at something called sabermetrics to get the very, very best players that would be able to work as a team. I'd imagine the name Dick Fosbury doesn't ring a bell in your heads, but I'm sure that what he innovated in his sport is something you're more familiar with. Up until the 1968 Mexico Olympics, people were trying to do the high jump like this. Now, of course, this did work up to a point, but Dick Fosbury thought about the way his biomechanics worked and jumped like this. Which I'm sure you will agree is a far more familiar look. It became known as the Fosbury Flop, and it's the way that all high jumpers jump now. But Dick Fosbury was the first person to innovate this, and after the 1968 Olympics, everybody jumped this way. Another pronunciation mangle here, but Jan Berklöv, Swedish ski jumper, not the greatest ski jumper in the world, but up until Jan Berklöv came along, everybody was doing ski jumps with their skis parallel. Berklöv was the first person to do the ski jumps with the V shape of the skis, and I'm sure you'll agree, this is how everybody ski jumps now. Another innovator. And that brings us on to the next person, another person I'm a huge fan of. Adam Hansen was a World Tour rider, holds the record for the most consecutive World Tour rides in a row, and he's a huge innovator, not only making his own shoes, which is pretty well known, but he also used to take apart the casing for his radios and make carbon, very lightweight cases for that. He was also one of the first people I ever saw riding his bike without a bike computer on the bike and wearing a watch because it's lighter. And he also devised a lot of software that the teams use to work out where the bikes and where the riders are around the world and where it all brings it together. The guy would be an expert in multiple areas of any career, and economics and finance, in terms of 3D printing and design, and again, just a basically genius innovator, which also brings us on to the ubiquitous comment about innovators when we come to cycling is Graham Obery, the famous time trialist, world hour record, who thought about the aerodynamics and the position on the bike to such a degree that he completely revolutionized the way people thought about aerodynamics, to the point where the UCI had to keep banning his positions because he was basically making them look foolish. Dan Bigham's background in Formula One racing and engineering has given him an aerodynamic insight that I believe is probably the best brain in cycling at the minute. His approach to the team pursuit with the Hoob Watt bike team, again, embarrassed the authorities so much that the UCI had to change rules. There's definitely a bit of a pattern forming here that innovators seem to ruffle the feathers of those in charge and make them look possibly a little bit stupid. But he ultimately epitomised this in his hour record attempt when he managed to ride approximately 200 metres further than Bradley Wiggins' world record, but he rode at a considerably lower wattage. Wiggins' record was ridden around about an estimated 420 to 450 watts, whereas Dan Bigham's 200 metre further record attempt was ridden between 355 and 360 watts, all down to aerodynamics. So now that we've had a look at some people that have thought about the sport in a different context in terms of how they actually do the sport, and we've also had a look at how people generically use that sport and think within it how they could make some changes. So how does this apply to us? How does this make our brains work, and how can we think about how this applies to us? Well, in the first context, if we think about triathletes with swimming, cycling and running, think about your environment, think about where you live, think about where your work might take you. Perhaps there's some way of linking where you live and where you travel to work, or maybe you'd be walking along somewhere and thinking, I wonder if anyone's actually ever ridden a bike up that road, or just trying to think about the context of your environment might be a way of giving you an idea of thinking about your sport innovatively. Take a chap like Steve Price. Steve Price is known as 3 Channels Steve Price because he was the first person to swim the Bristol, the Irish and the English Channel. Now, the Irish Channel is absolutely lethal and far more dangerous than you might first think. He actually took him several attempts to do that. The English Channel, well, still there are more people that have climbed Everest than have swum the English Channel. And then the Bristol Channel, well, this is the one that started it. Steve moved to Clevedon in 1985 and used to swim in Clevedon and would look across at Penarth and think, I wonder if anyone's actually swum that. And once he'd done that, it opened up this idea of swimming the 3 other channels. Or maybe there's an event that you'd like to replicate. Now, obviously, this was the instigator for my grand tour that I did last year, the idea that I love the Tour de France so much. And I thought to myself, well, I just wonder if I can do this. And maybe that's the way to think about it, is maybe look at your environment or look at other events and seeing if you can replicate it. The Everesting idea, for example. That's one thing that you could think about. How can I take the sport that I'm interested in and think about it in a completely innovative way that will motivate me and get me doing something that nobody else perhaps has ever done before? In terms of the sorts of things that you might be able to do within a more generic context, within the sport that you might be doing already, there are thousands of things you could think about, particularly if we take swim, bike, run for a triathlete. But even if we take each one of those individually, there must be little things that your skill set will allow you to have little innovations with. It might be that you understand textiles and that you're a bit of an expert in that area. Perhaps you could tweak your clothing or some method to do with the trainer fastening or anything along those lines. Perhaps you're a nutrition expert. Perhaps there's things that you could do that would allow you to create a perfect balance of food for you to use in a long course triathlon. Perhaps you're an amazing mathematician, or perhaps an engineer or a CAD designer, where you could think about creating an actual bottle between the arms that functions and works properly, or some method for the race belt to be a little bit more efficient, or any little tweaks, any ideas that you might come up with. I'm a massive fan of this approach. I've always been a real tinkerer. Even when I was playing in bands when I was younger, I was always fixing things to the bottom of my seat using Velcro so that I had a drum key to hand, or thinking about different ways that I could basically create less friction between where I was and where I want to get to. And sometimes that involves looking at different materials, and looking at tapes and Velcro and plastic products and carbon fiber and things like that, and trying new skills out to see if there are just little tweaks that would just make the way that you race slightly different. Just one of the little ways that I've used one of my own skills, for example, was an interest in looking at the way that Josh Tarling was taking corners at Castle Combe racetrack. So I cleared it with the race authorities to see if I could put a drone up to see how the fastest riders were taking certain corners as they were going around. And this gave me a great insight into what I thought was a good line and what the people that are genuinely going fast were doing. So that would be my advice to you. Think about your skill set, your soft and your hard skill set. Soft skills being the transferable skills, things like organisation, timekeeping, communication, and the more hard technical skills, things like being able to use CAD to design things, or technical drawing, or textiles and sewing and stuff like that. Or perhaps you know somebody that is capable of doing those things. But in my opinion, there are multiple little tweaks and twists you can make to make things a little bit more bespoke for you. Whether it's cover caps for bottle cages that you're not using, whether it's bespoke risers for your TT bars, whether it's using grip tape for your handlebars rather than using the normal type of tape, whatever it might be, any of these little tips, tricks, hacks, bodges, whatever you might want to call them, might just be not just a difference to your actual race, but some kind of motivator or an interest level for you to get out there and try these things out. Whatever you do though, whatever the innovations are, make sure you do them in a safe way and it doesn't cause you to crash or do somebody else a mischief.